All right, good morning, church. All right, I'm going to be hanging out here today. Okay, so before we get into our continuing our study in the book of Hebrews, those of you who have taken home a box or are planning to take home a box, those are due back by the Sunday service, November 16th. So the Sunday service, when RL Ministries will be here, we need those boxes back so we can take those down to the DC. Anybody watching, or if you have a kid in Awanas and you got boxes to bring back for Awana night, the Wednesday night, the 12th, the boxes will be due for that. And we'll collect all those together, take those down to the Baltimore DC. I believe I mentioned it last week that Baltimore alone last year put out 10% of the total number of boxes that went out for Operation Christmas Child. That's amazing. That one city, I think they put out like 990,000 boxes. It's almost 1 million boxes last year. So if you want to know if this ministry does go somewhere, it does. It literally travels all over the world. I've seen it firsthand. A couple counties south of me in West Virginia, there's an area that actually receives these boxes as well. So they don't just go out into the international third world, which is sometimes what we think. They actually go to domestic areas as well for kids whose families can't afford Christmas or need school-related items, toys, all those come in there. And so this is an awesome ministry, and it does have a worldwide impact, including in this country. And live nativity sign up. So you probably saw Melissa Eiler walking around with these bright yellow sheets. Right, and so if you were signed up back there, we're going to get your name against that. So if your spouse did what my spouse did and signed you up, then you're good. All right, we got your name. But this one actually it gives you an option down here of I want to bring food, help with traffic. I think we had 1,500 cars come through in the duration of 2 nights last year. That's a lot. Help with scenes, so setting up the various scenes in the buildings. If you like to play with fire, there's a fire pit out there.
That's why I'm always a wise guy.
Mike's a wise guy. Just remember, this is nativity, so bring kosher marshmallows. The marshmallows with bacon in them, you can't do that. This is first century. Somebody's going to bring bacon-filled marshmallows now, aren't they? So tear down and clean up. These are all areas of service around this ministry to the community. And as people drive through, the narration plays on the radio station as they come through. It's an awesome ministry. It was a lot of fun last year. Wear gloves. Just make sure they're kosher gloves. And someone's going to catch me afterwards and go, "What are kosher gloves?" And so, but it was cold last year. It was windy, but it was a lot of fun. And so we had food downstairs. We had scheduled shifts as well. And so they'll sign you up for all that stuff. But if you're interested in that, come get one of these, fill it out, hand it back to either turn it to the church office, hand it to Melissa, and we'll consolidate all of these and start contacting folks for that. Okay, so letter to the Hebrews, the basic principles of the oracles of God. We have been in the first 6 chapters of the book, of essentially a 13-chapter book in our English Bibles. And today, the author of Hebrews is doing exactly what he promised. And so he said in chapter 5 that his readers, I should say, had become lazy of the ears. Lazy listeners is basically the best way to convey that from Greek. It says dull of hearing, sometimes sluggish of hearing. That word sluggish is really the Greek word lazy of the ears. And so he has built a foundation as to who the person of Jesus is, primarily from the Old Testament. He's making his own arguments as to how to read the Old Testament scripture so that we understand who Jesus is. And today, in the text, he moves on. He says, let us press on in chapter 6, verses 1 through 3. He says, let us press on. And here he begins to press on. And the thing that he's pressing on with is exactly the thing in chapter 5 that he says, we have more to talk about concerning this. And it's this person of Melchizedek. And we're going to look at who that person is in the Bible over the next 2 weeks. And this is a very, even amongst PhD commentators, there is a lot of dispute over who this person is in the Old Testament. Because he only appears once, and he's only referred to one time other than his appearance in the book of Genesis. But we're going to look at everything together. We're going to dive into the oracles of God and see why the writer of Hebrews keeps focusing on this person. So before we do that, let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father, Lord, teach us from your words. You gave us your scriptures as a gift. Let us not take that lightly. Let us understand that true spiritual maturity does not come from programs and doesn't come from fellowship that is devoid of understanding who our God is. Lord, we can't have one without having the other. We could risk fellowshipping incorrectly without understanding who our God is. When we gather together, it's to celebrate our one common thread across all of us here in this room is that we all believe and confess that Jesus of Nazareth is the Messiah sent by the God of Israel to earth to redeem humanity. Lord, that is our confession. That is what we have. And that we have this wonderful, wonderful future that you have promised in your scriptures. And while many are confused about what that future is, Lord, give us clarity from your text. Let us understand that this is a source of revelation, not just to understand future events, but to provide comfort, that we can take solace in the idea that you're not done, Jesus, with this planet. There are many paradigms out there that separates earth from heaven, and that heaven is the good thing and earth is the bad thing. Lord, let us understand that the redemption story involves what you're going to do here. And that we can't talk about heaven without talking about what God's going to do with earth. Even in the eternal state, there will be a new heaven and a new earth. Lord, let us understand these things. Let us seek after them so that we can have comfort in knowing who our God is. I ask this in your Son's name. Amen. Okay, so last week we were discussing Abraham and this idea of through faith and patience, Abraham inherited his promises, and that he's actually still seeing them come to fruition. Abraham is with the Lord. He's to be absent from the bodies, to be present with the Lord for believers. He is with God, and he is seeing his promises still unfold. That's a very exciting idea, that we are part of this family of faith, and Abraham as our chieftain, so to speak, is sitting back, along with the rest of the saints in the presence of the Lord, are seeing these things unfold while they worship our God. And we continued yet last week in 6 verse 13 when God made his promise to Abraham, Avraham. We talked about the meaning of that name. It means chieftain of a multitude or strong chief of a multitude. His name was changed from their chief, Avram, to Avraham, the chieftain of a multitude. That there was no one greater for him to swear by. This is God. God swore by himself, saying, I will surely bless you and surely multiply you. And this is a story in Genesis 22. And this quotation is Genesis 22:17. And so after waiting patiently, Abraham received what was promised. And so Abraham becomes this example, almost the counter example to the Exodus generation. That every time they heard the voice of God, they rebelled 10 times. And finally God says, you know what? You're not going to go into the land. Now what's interesting is when you get to Abraham, I'll switch to Abraham here. When you read about Abraham, every time God speaks, Abraham doesn't do that. Abraham runs toward him. Abraham can go into Egypt, and what does he do after Egypt? He returns where? Back to the land. There is a contrast, a direct contrast between the Exodus generation and the person of Abraham. In that he is obedient, he gets to go back into the land after going to Egypt. Israel does not. The greater nation has to wait. And so we see these comparison and contrast that the writer of Hebrews has been giving us throughout his letter, saying, go back to the Old Testament. Look at our generation that came out of Egypt. They never went into the land. That generation had to die, with the exception of Joshua and Caleb. But the generation, including Moses, Aaron, Miriam, they all died before the second generation could go into the land. But it was not that way with Abraham. Why? Because he trusted. In a generation that did not trust, this man did, their progenitor. And so we see that he's using these examples for us. And then we see here in Abraham, so this is Genesis 22, 13 and 14. So before the quotation in Hebrews 6, we see this famous statement, and this is I won't call it a thesis statement, but this is the central statement, if you will, as to what the story of Genesis 22 is trying to teach us. And we see this in verses 13 and 14. And Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, and behind him was a ram, caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son, Isaac. And Abraham called the name of that place, Adonai shall see to it. Now we're going to come back to this in a little bit. Adonai shall see to it. As it is said to this day, and we don't know who wrote this, by the way. This could be Moses, or this could be someone toward the end of the exile saying, we still say this in 400 BC, that on the mountain of Adonai, and we see previously that that's Mount Moriah, which is another name for Mount Zion, on the mountain of Adonai it shall be seen to. And that seems to be a common phrase or idiom in Jewish culture at the time, that if you had a dispute between two people and it had to escalate in the court, where would you go? You go to Jerusalem, and you would go to the courts, and on the mountain of Adonai, this shall be seen to. If there was a sacrifice that needed to be made, where was it made? On the mountain of Adonai, it shall be seen to. When Jesus was put on trial, where was it done? On the mountain of Adonai, it shall be seen to. And so we see this phrase as a looming, as we call it, it's a typology, that this phrase was coined from this type of Abraham offering his son on this specific piece of geography. That when you look for God to resolve issues, we should expect for God to resolve them in one particular geographical location. This is what we call in theology sacred geography. There's sacred time. There were times when Israel had to go to Jerusalem to worship, which is Passover, Shavuot, which we call Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles. So there's sacred time, but sacred time is always tied to sacred place or sacred geography. And this came to be a common phrase in Jewish culture, that we should expect God to resolve things on Mount Zion. And it's also true in Rabbinic Judaism, even to this day, that on the pinnacle of Mount Zion, where the Ark of the Covenant once sat, that God spoke the world into existence from that stone. They have a continuity in their theology, and I would propose, church, and we're going to look at this today, that they pulled this, the rabbis that came up with that idea, they didn't invent it out of thin air or some kind of arbitration. They were carefully reading the scriptures and arrived at something that as biblical Christians, we should be arriving at as well. There's a solid hermeneutic, there's a solid method of interpretation behind the idea of the continuity of Zion, the importance of this sacred geography from Genesis 1:1 unto Revelation 22. And so we see this typology that we should expect God to resolve things on his mountain. And so we looked at this again last week, is that Jesus, he's the real deal. He's not a type. We're going to look at typology in a little bit. But he's not a type. He's the Messiah. He's the thing that all the types in the Bible point towards. He's the creator of Mount Zion. That's actually in the Psalms, that this Holy One of Israel that's expected to come, he's the one who created Zion. Why was it important for the psalmist to say that? He's trying to get us back to this idea of sacred geography. And we know who this person is. And then the writer of Hebrews, he ends chapter 6 this way. He says, we have this hope as an anchor for the soul. Firm and secure, it enters the inner sanctuary behind the curtain. So behind the most holy place, this is temple imagery, where our forerunner, Yeshua, or Jesus, has entered on our behalf. He's entered before God's presence on our behalf as an advocate. He's a priest. Just like Yom Kippur, the high priest Aaron's line was only to go before God on Yom Kippur. He says Jesus has done this, and it never says Jesus exits like Yom Kippur. He goes before the presence of God. Why? Because he is God. But as the priest, he is able to go before permanently, if he so wishes, before the presence of God as a permanent advocate. According to the high priest for eternity in the arrangement of Melchizedek. And so he keeps saying this, according to the arrangement of Melchizedek, according to the arrangement of Melchizedek. And it should be a red flag, if you're reading critically, church, that Jesus, out of the gate, before we go into chapter 7, out of the gate, that Jesus here is operating continually as this high priest in this arrangement of Melchizedek. And the question that should loom in your mind, at least it does in mine, is Melchizedek has this arrangement priesthood, so to speak, that Jesus is part of. But the next question I always ask myself is, are you telling me that there's two people in there? Melchizedek and the Messiah? You're telling me that there's two people who continually advocate before God? That's a red flag. That's not continuous, or has no continuity with what the writer of Hebrews has previously said. And this is a good question to ask if you're reading critically, because when we get to Genesis, we're going to see Melchizedek just kind of appears on the scene. He's kind of an unnatural anomaly. We don't hear about him before, and then when he comes, he disappears just as quickly. So if you have your Bibles, we're going to be in chapter 7, verses 1 through 3 today. It's also on the handouts. And so he finishes this priesthood of Jesus, talking about the arrangement of Melchizedek, and then he goes into describing this person known as Melchizedek. In Hebrew, it's actually two words in Hebrew, Melchizedek. And so it actually means ruler of righteousness. We're going to see that, or king of righteousness. For this Melchizedek, king of Shalem, or king of Salem, priest of Most High God. In the Hebrew text, that's El Elyon. If you ever heard the God called El Elyon, God Most High. He met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings. These are the kings that came from Elam, modern-day southern Iran. They invaded, kidnapped Abraham's nephew Lot, the son of Haran, Abraham's brother. And Abraham, being a good chieftain, he goes to war and brings his family members back. And so he's doing exactly, even today, if you've watched the news, you've heard about these Arab Bedouin clans that are fighting against Hamas. They say, oh, clan such and such in Gaza is fighting against Hamas. They have chieftains. This is really similar. And so like a good chief, he's looking out for his greater extended family, and he goes and rescues his nephew. Why? Because that's a slight against him as the chief. And so he goes to war. He pulls 300 men. Abraham was not wandering around, like I said, like the movies portray, this old man wandering around a desert in a bathrobe. This guy was actually a warrior and was a longtime chieftain of his clan. And so he brings them out. They go to war. He comes back, brings back Lot, runs into this person near this place called Shalem. We're going to find out where that is. And to him, Abraham apportioned a tenth of everything. He is first, by translation of his name, King of Righteousness, Melchizedek. And then he's also the King of Salem, that is, King of Peace. And that's a play on words there between Shalem in Aramaic and Shalom in Hebrew. He is without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he continues a priest forever. And we're going to look at this verse 3, because this is what confuses a lot of people when it says resembling the Son of God. That resembling is only used one time in the whole Bible, right there. So we have to establish what that actually means. It's what we call a hapax legomena. It's only used one time in the whole of Scripture. So before we get into that, let's talk about types and typology. If you haven't heard of typology before, this is something that's really common in the Old Testament, where something or someone is used as a symbol. That's the other word for typology. Topos is just the Greek word for symbol. We bring it forward as type, but it's translated symbol sometimes in the scriptures. Sometimes it says, when Peter says to the elders, be examples to your flock, it says be topos, be types. So an example. In the Oxford English Dictionary, they define it this way. The study of symbolic representation, so typology is the study of this, symbolic significance, symbolism. And around religion, the study of the origin and meaning of scriptural types. And then Roy Zuck, if you're in hermeneutics in Schaeffer Seminary, they may use Dr. Zuck's purple book, the purple and white book, Basic Bible Interpretation. He talks about in a whole chapter, he devotes a chapter to this, of this idea of type or topos. And those of you who are machinists, the striking die that strikes out plate steel to make a shape of something, the die is the type. It's meant to strike and produce the real thing you want, right? So from a machining standpoint, it's a die, a tooling die. Shape or a statue, if you have a statue, the representation of something. A model to imitate, symbol. These are ways that it's used in Greek. In the Bible, types in the Old Testament are prophetic symbols, and that's really important to understand. Prophetic symbols. Representatives of what to look for in the Messiah, fulfilled by him in the New Testament. And so this is really important. Sometimes it's not just the Messiah, it's also the Messianic reign. There's things that are types of what it will look like in the future. And these are all considered symbols. There's actually one coming up, if you need a good comparison, if you watch the news. This coming Wednesday, I hate to bring up, this is a negative type. This is not a type that you want to promote or emulate, but there is a protest coming to D.C. on November 5th. Have you guys seen this? If you're going to go home and everyone's going to go Google this on the news, right? So on November 5th, there is a protest coming to Washington, D.C. that is put on by not Antifa, but a new nonprofit called Refuse Fascism. So not Antifa, because that was labeled a terrorist organization. It's now called Refuse Fascism, and it is aligned with the whole No Kings rally. And you say, why Wednesday? Why Wednesday, November 5th? Well, it's more about the calendar date than the fact that it's Wednesday. Does anybody remember a poem that starts, remember, the 5th of November? The gunpowder plot? Okay. So they're coming to Washington, D.C. in a couple of days as a symbol or a type. And anybody that has a little bit of background in English literature is going to, in English history, British history, is going to understand this. As a symbol or type of the gunpowder plot of 1605. Now, what was that? As the Tudor dynasty died off with Elizabeth I, her next closest cousin that had claim to the throne was King James Stuart VI of Scotland. And he became King James I of England. And under King James, there was the unification of the crowns of Scotland and England. And if you watch the coronation of King Charles, he had to stand on the stone of destiny in Westminster Abbey. That's the stone that the Irish kings, the high kings, used to have to stand on. Supposedly one of the Irish high kings loaned it to the King of Scotland, his cousin, to legitimize himself as a high king. And then the English took it with King James down to Westminster. It's been there ever since. And so Scotland's wanted this thing back. They tried to steal it a couple of times. And because whoever stands on it from one of the noble families would be, in Scottish culture, Celtic culture, the legitimate King of Scotland. But he stood on it. Charles did. Elizabeth did before him. But they did not want a Scottish king. And so they decided to do this thing called the Gunpowder Plot of 1605. It used to be called the Gunpowder Treason Plot, sometimes called the Jesuit Treason, because James was a Protestant king. They unsuccessfully attempted And there was a movie called V for Vendetta back in the early 2000s that talked about this. But this guy by the name of Robert Catesby and Guy Fawkes, you probably heard Guy Fawkes, sometimes called Guido Fawkes. They decided that the idea that they should commence to carrying out was to put giant barrels of gunpowder under Parliament when James was there and blow it up. And it was the whole plot was thwarted. And so now this protest is beginning here around this idea of President Trump being and I'm not here to get into politics, but President Trump being a supposed king. And why did they pick November 5th? Where was Trump's mother from? Scotland. There's a reason they're doing this. Is this giant type, this giant symbol where they say it's a non-violent continual protest, but we're going to do it on the commemorative day 420 years later. That was good math. 420 years later of the attempt of blowing up King James. Remember the 5th of November. And if you ever read the poem, it's telling people to remember it so that it's not repeated, not to celebrate it. But that's a type. That's a type. The actual antitype was the original plot in 1605. So we see this. Even today, we use types, we use symbols. This was Wednesday night. All the kids were doing superhero night. So everyone was dressed up as a superhero. Mike Schaefer, I always knew it. I knew it. And you had no idea that you're like the centerpiece of the sermon today, just FYI, and you'll see why in a minute. And between you and Steve Mazer behind you, you guys are like, put you two together, you're going to get it here in a minute. But these are types, right? They're representing the anti-type, which would be the real deal. So we have Batman. We had a kid dressed up in SWAT gear. That was awesome. He had like the full-on riot gear thing. That was cool. Several different kinds of caped crusaders. Mike had his shirt half open with a Superman S underneath it. That was pretty cool. That was the phone booth scene, right? And so all these kids are types of the actual superheroes that we grew up with. But we're going to look at some other types today and then come back to Melchizedek because we have to really understand symbolism versus the real deal. And so before we get into this clip, we got two clips we're going to watch around typology because sometimes we think of superheroes as something for kids, okay? And we don't think of why people like Stan Lee and Jerry Siegel, we're going to see in a minute, why they came up with this. It wasn't just to entertain children. Comic books, and those of you who grew up reading comic books, they sometimes instruct. And they instruct in a very effective way because it creates a scenario by which to weigh against different ideologies. And something that happened, and I'm going to go into this real quick, I'm going to tee this up, because a type was developed. Are the Lewises here? Here. They're all pointing fingers. So, Rosie was born April 18th, 1938. Was that correct? Okay, this type was born and published on April 18th, 1938. This type was born, the day that Rosie Lewis was born, this type was also born. That hit me driving to work this morning. So why did this type develop? And we're going to look at it here in a minute. But there was a person by the name of Charles Darwin. Probably heard of Charles Darwin. He wrote Origins of Species. And so at the early 19th century, he mentored a man by the name of Francis Galton, who came up with this idea of this thing called eugenics. Has anybody heard of eugenics? Right? So good genes, literally, right? And so it's good breeding. Well, that came off of Origin of Species. That every species, if Darwin's correct, if Darwinian thought is correct, that all species breed unto a better form of themselves. That's the idea. Only the strong survive. Now, what's interesting is Francis Galton was Charles Darwin's cousin. They knew each other. He mentored a man. Now, his thought, he coined the term eugenics in 1883, Francis Galton. He mentored a man named Havelock Ellis, who was having an affair in Britain with a woman by the name of Margaret Sanger. Anybody heard the name Margaret Sanger? Okay, they were having an affair in Britain. He convinced her to move to America to enact eugenics in the United States in the form of the Birth Control Federation of America in 1939. In 1942, they changed their name to Planned Parenthood. And Margaret Sanger's eugenics idea was initially to sterilize lesser races so that they would not breed again and that the Anglo race would be the greatest. And she set up shop in New York. From there, it went from sterilization unto, as we know, systematic abortions and the death of over 60 million. But this was eugenics stateside. Eugenics took on a feminine form stateside. Where else did eugenics take off? It took a very masculine form, a militaristic form, in Germany. Eugenics was the ideological foundation of the Nazi Party. And so Britain exported eugenics unto Germany in one form and eugenics unto America in another form. And on both sides of it, as it's coming in the early 1900s, you have these two guys named Joe Shuster and Jerry Siegel in Cleveland, Ohio, who decide to come up with a counter thought against this idea of the superior human that eugenics was propagating. That through breeding and through careful selection, the things you hear about Heinrich Himmler doing with the SS, those things that they were doing in Germany actively and that Margaret Sanger was doing through the process of extermination in her life, they wanted to come up with the opposite counter idea to this. And so they came up with a type, and we're going to look at how deep this rabbit hole goes. First off, let's take a look at who the type is. This has volume to it too. There we go. Okay, so the type that they came up with, they even borrowed from the German word Übermensch, and named him Superman. Birthed on April 18th, 1938. And originally, a lot of people don't realize this, but the villain Lex Luthor, you know what he was? He was a Nazi. In the early comics, Superman battled the Nazis. What was he battling against? The Übermensch. The German concept, the eugenic concept of an Übermensch. And they had some things they pulled from to create the type. The first thing, these two boys, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, sons of Jewish immigrants who fled Eastern Europe and anti-Semitism and moved to Cleveland. Now, I believe Joe's family, they had to flee to Canada and then come into Cleveland. But these two boys, they grew up in high school together, and one was really good at writing stories, and one was really good at art, and they put this guy together. And they pulled some ideas together in order to create the character, the type, in order that their readers would identify. And you can see who their readers originally were here. Look at this. He escapes the doomed civilization of the old world. Who were their parents? They come to America. They go right to the middle of the country, to Kansas. You know, America of America. You want to go to America, you go to the heartland. So he grows up in the heartland. He fights the Nazis and their concept of the Übermensch. They started with this. Now, those alone, we can see a type of the American Jewish experience in that many who fled Austria, Germany, Switzerland, Poland, Ukraine, Russia in the 1930s, what did a lot of those veterans do? I just gave it away. They signed back up and said, I speak German, put me in the game. A lot of Jewish veterans went right back over. Right back, some of them to their hometowns. Only to find out their shtetl, their village, was gone. But they knew they had to put a stop to this. But inside our own country, we had our own struggles of this eugenics, and it's actually just been overturned in a big way a few years ago. This has been going on in this country for almost 100 years now. Actually, over 100 years. And they said this has to stop. And so we think of Superman as truth, justice, and what? The American way. What were they saying? Truth, justice, and, by the way, this is what we think as Jews in America. There's a tie between the American, the idea of what Superman represents of the American way and our Judeo-Christian culture. And Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, this was not lost on them. However, they did not stop here. Now, you think of Superman being bulletproof, he can fly, he crashes through a mountain in that one clip, and he gets up from it and rethinks his strategy on how to get off the ground. But there's more to this type, and they did this on purpose. They've gone through several interviews now. Well, now they've passed away. But when they were interviewed on this, there was more in their Jewish upbringing that came forth in this type. And I hope you understand the reason I'm showing you this is as you study a type, you start to see the antitype. And you see through even the limitations of the type. All types have limitations because it's meant to point to something else. And so we see this much. But then we have this other clip. And those of you who grew up in the 70s and the 80s, and your parents bought you Superman pajamas, probably remember this scene. Probably one of the most memorable scenes in all of these Superman films. I remember going to see Superman Returns in 2006, and the place was crowded. You know where I was? Jerusalem. During the war with Hezbollah, everybody wanted to get out of their homes. It was like COVID. You had to stay home. Everyone had blast shields on their windows. And when Superman Returns came out, we went over to the mall in Jerusalem. Yeah, Jerusalem has a shopping mall. And we went to the theater, and it was packed. I think it was either opening night or Saturday night. Why do you think all those Israelis were kicking down the door to watch the movie? They know this. They know this. And they love seeing Americans come to go see the movie. Because they're like, you know what we have in common? We have Superman in common. He's very important. But then we have this other speech, and this stirred up a lot of conversations in 2006. from the first movie that Richard Donner directed. As I call it, the good one. Here we go. This has sound as well.
My son, you do not remember me. I am Jor-El. I am your father. By now you will have reached your 18th year, as it is measured on earth. By that reckoning, I will have been dead for many thousands of your years. The knowledge that I have matters physical and historic. I have given you fully on your voyage to your new home. These are important matters, to be sure, but still matters of mere fact. There are questions to be asked, and it is time for you to do so. Here in this fortress of solitude, we shall try to find the answers together. So, my son, speak.
Who am I?
Your name is Kal-El. You are the only survivor of the planet Krypton. Even though you've been raised as a human being, you are not one of them. You have great powers, only some of which you have as yet discovered.
Come with me now, my son, as we break through the bars of your earthly confinement, traveling through time and space. In the sixth dimension, your powers will far exceed those of mortal man. It is forbidden for you to interfere with human history. Rather let your leadership stir others too. In this next year, we shall examine the human heart. It is more fragile than a roll. For the past 2 years, as we pass through the flaming turmoil which is the edge of your own galaxy, we will enter the realm of the red Krypton sun, source of your strength and nourishment and cause of our eventual destruction. The planet Krypton, my son, your home, as it was. This year, we shall examine the various concepts of immortality and their basis in actual fact. The total accumulation of all knowledge spanning the 28 known galaxies is embedded in the crystals which I have sent along with you. Study them well, my son. Over the past 12 years, we have reasoned out logical judgments. By the time we return to the confines of your galaxy, 12 of your years will have passed. For this reason, among others, I have chosen Earth for you. It is now time for you to rejoin your new world and to serve its collective humanity. Live as one of them, Kal-El, to discover where your strength and your power are needed. But always hold in your heart the pride of your special heritage. They can be a great people, Kal-El, they wish to be. They only lack the light to show the way. For this reason, above all, their capacity for good, I have sent them you, my only son.
Okay. How many people are like, John, stop preaching, let's just watch the movie? Probably the best Superman film of all time. Man of Steel was probably just after that. But Richard Donner, when he directed this, he actually went back into the comics, and so did the screenplay writers, and they wanted to bring this idea forward. And there's a lot in there. There's a lot packed into this film. And if you remember how the film opens, it actually shows the 1938 comic. And they start reading the narrative and everything of the used to be called Action Comics in the 30s. But Superman here, we see a different type. Not just this experience of battling the German Übermensch, but we see this person who seems to be human, but he isn't. He's otherworldly. And obviously the limitations of the type is that Jesus is fully man and fully God, but he did come and invade this world from elsewhere. He was adopted by the Kents. I find it very ironic that the initials of his parents are J and M. John and Martha Kent are his adopted parents, as opposed to Joseph and Mary. His superhuman powers, he becomes self-aware. And we see that Jesus became self-aware of who he was at a very young age, not at 18. He was in Isaiah 50, the 50th chapter of Isaiah, talks about how the Messiah will be educated by God directly. And you hear a lot of the Pharisees and read a lot of the Pharisees in the gospel saying, where did this guy get his learning? He's not from a yeshiva. He didn't go to yeshiva. He didn't learn from one of the seminaries in and around Jerusalem. Where did this guy learn? And it says God personally taught him. He's educated by his father from the other world directly. We see that. Begins his service and guiding humanity at the age of 30. And that's true of both the films and the comics. He's from a noble heritage in the house of El. Sometimes we miss this, but the house of El is the house that Jesus, and Superman is from, the house of El. What does El mean in Hebrew? God. He's from the house of God. You see this? His name is Kal El. Kal El, if you've had Hebrew, is voice of God. His given name is voice of God, Kal El. And his father's name is Jor-El. Well, Yor-El in Hebrew means God will enlighten. God will turn on the light switch. And Schuster and Siegel, they knew this. We see a type or symbol of the Messiah. The one thing you see, and there's limitations to the type, of course, the fact that Superman's not to rule over humanity, but guide them in leadership in the person of the Jewish Messiah. I want him to come rule and fix things here, right? But he is to be physically manifested, and he's actually guided by his other world. And then I had to add this picture because it's obvious. This is what the Israelis know. Superman is Jewish. And they say this. It's Superman. He's a Jew. We know this. But there's a lot there. And the Marlon Brando scene, I find it very ironic that the guy playing God the Father is the Godfather. That's a topic of another discussion, is that the Godfather is playing God the Father. He made Superman an offer he couldn't refuse. And so, anyway. But we have this type, and what types are meant to do is give us a limited paradigm that directs us a little bit more forward toward the real thing. And then you'll have another type over here that's a little bit more forward toward the real thing. And so we come back to the person of Melchizedek in Hebrews 7, and this is an ongoing academic debate. And I'm going to try not to get too cerebral on this. Is the question of, is this guy a symbol, or is this guy the real deal? Okay, now up to this point, we've had symbols in the book of Hebrews. Our priestly symbol has been Aaron. We looked at this in previous weeks. He's the type. How do we know that? He has to make offerings for his own sins. He says Aaron is like the person of Jesus, except that Aaron has to give offerings for his own sins. So he's called by God himself. He's chosen by God to act on behalf of others. He deals gently with the ignorant and the straying, just like God does, but he has to make offerings. When he sins, the high priest of Israel cannot go and give, for example, the Yom Kippur offering for the nation on the Day of Atonement without first giving an offering for his own sin. And so the types always have limitations. This is incredibly important. And this is the thing that, and when you look at the limitations, that's what separates type from real deal. Symbol from the actual thing. And as we continue, the reason I'm harping on this, as we get into chapters 8, 9, and 10 of Hebrews, guess what we start seeing? Symbol, real thing. Over and over and over and over again. Mosaic law, law of Messiah. Priestly Aaron pointing towards the Messianic priest. We see this over and over again. He calls it a bust versus the face or the body. The real deal, we looked at this. Jesus became a source of eternal salvation and this continual priesthood because he never has to stop to give offerings for his own sin. Why? He's sinless. Therefore, his service before God has never stopped. He's always been the priest. He's the eternal priest, the priest for eternity. And we saw this in the Psalms, that every time he prays, God hears him. There's actually a scenario in the Torah that if the priest is sinful, God may not hear his prayers. God may actually ignore them until he gets right with the Lord. He's a believer. He's saved, but that gives us some practical application of what it means to get right with the Lord in order for the Lord to hear our prayers. You know, Jesus never has to struggle with that. Anytime he speaks to his Father, guess who hears him? God hears him. God the Father hears his Son. He was saved from death. That's something Aaron was not saved from. Aaron died and he's still dead. He'll be resurrected one day, but he was not saved from death. Jesus is the real deal. And there's zero disruption in his service. Now keep that in your mind as we start looking at this person of Melchizedek. So if you have your Bibles, let's go to Genesis 14. Let's read this story real quick. This is a very short story, and it's meant to be short. It's meant to, if you have read through Genesis, or if you're doing like a read through the Bible, this story of Melchizedek should feel unnatural, as almost like a break in the story. You should be asking why this is in there. Because Abraham has just gone to war, just gotten his nephew back, and it says after his return from the defeat of Kedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Shaveh, that is the king's valley. And then it says this, and Melchizedek, king of Shalem, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. And he was priest of El Elyon, God Most High. And he blessed him and said, "Blessed be Avram by El Elyon, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be El Elyon, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." So this man is, whoever this person is, he's standing in between Avram, blessing Avram, but then he's also blessing God himself. He actually stands in the middle, blessing both directions. And then it says this one line, and Avram gave him a tenth from all. We're going to look at that. But this phrase here, and he was priest of El Elyon, that's just kind of thrown in there. And the was in your English Bibles is because this is a past tense narrative. There is no word was in the Hebrew text. It is just as logical and just as viable to read this as, and he is a priest of El Elyon. You follow me? Because it's just qualifying who the person of Melchizedek is. So even when you're telling a past tense narrative, if you're telling this to your kids, you could say, and Melchizedek came, and he's a priest of El Elyon. And then you continue in the story. It's just as viable to put is there as it was. And he blessed him and said this. And Abram, for some reason, gives this guy a tenth of everything. But what does this mean? King of Shalem. We're going to hang on to this idea, King of Shalem, because we're going to go back to, now that's the first mentioning of Melchizedek. The second mentioning we've already talked about. Okay, that's Psalm 110. Melody of David, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool. Jesus says this is about the Messiah. The temple leaders in Matthew 23 says this is about the Messiah, this son of David. Jesus asks the question, how is he David's Lord if he's David's son? And it says, continuing, Adonai will send forth from Zion the staff. We talked about what that is, a staff in the summer months of your strength. And this is what the Messiah is supposed to do. So these are three things the Messiah is told to do. Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. The second thing he's supposed to do is dominate in the midst of your enemies With you, and this is from that Septuagint rendering, with you is the authority or dominion. In the day of your valor with splendors and holiness, from the womb before morning I begat you. So whoever this Messiah is, he's eternal. So he's at God's right hand. He's eternal. He has no beginning. And this is important when you go to read Hebrews, because does the Melchizedek priest have a beginning? He says he's without what? Beginning. And then it says this, you are a priest for eternity according to the arrangement of Melchizedek. And we had to ask the question, when did God say this to the Messiah? Because this was written in 1000 BC, but David's getting a vision of this and writing it down. It says this is a Psalm of David. When did God say this to God the Son? Did he all of a sudden just come on the scene and say, well, now you're the priest of Melchizedek? Let's keep going. This is a 6-verse psalm, real short. My Lord, which is in verse 1, the Messiah is at your, Adonai's right hand. So now this is David talking. He will smite kings in the day of his anger, in the day of his flared nostrils. He will administer judgment among the nations, filling it with carcasses. He will smite a head over the great land. When the Messiah comes to be the judge, there will be a head, singular, over the land of Israel that he shall smite. He will drink from the stream bed on the road, thus he will lift his head. After the battle, he's going to get a big drink of water and fight's over. We have a priest king here. Do you see that? But where was this priest king supposed to set up his rule? Where does it say in verse 2? Mount Zion. You see that? So we have a priest king of the order of Melchizedek, this arrangement of a priest king. And some theologians stop there and go, priest king, priest king. This Melchizedek's a type. And Jesus is ruling in Zion, and Melchizedek is in this other place called Salem. But the question we have to ask is, who is Melchizedek? This is really important. So we have these two things. Is when we compare the two accounts of Melchizedek in the whole of the Old Testament, he's only mentioned twice. In Genesis 14, he's a priest king of Shalem, which seems to be a place. His name means ruler of righteousness. And he blesses Abraham on behalf of God upon high, and Abraham gives him 1/10 of his possessions. So whoever this person is, Abraham goes, this guy's really important. And then in Psalm 110, Messiah is a continual priest king for eternity of the arrangement of Melchizedek. So how does that qualify this priesthood? This priesthood lasts how long? Without end. It's all the way back into eternity past. And when it says for eternity, that means both ways. And he'll rule as a king from Zion. Now this is important because we have to put these two together to ask if Melchizedek is a type, or what is he? Who is he? Who is the king of righteousness? That kind of gives it away, huh? Now here's the big question. If these are both priest kings, let's say that Psalm 110 is Jesus and Genesis 14 is another person, then what is so important about the location when it says King of Shalem? Is it the same place as Zion? This is that inductive Bible study work that we have to do to arrive at who this person is. If you want to turn in your Bibles, I'm going to be in Psalm 76, but then I'm going to go to 2 and 9. Psalm 76. Verses 1 and 2, is Shalem the same place, Salem the same place as Zion? One way to put this is, are we talking about Superman here, or are we talking about the real deal? To the choir master with stringed instruments, a psalm of Asaph. In Judah, God has made himself known. His name is great in Israel. Shalem became his sukkah. That's literally what it means. The Feast of Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles. God put a tent up in Shalem. And his habitation is upon Zion. This is what we call a parallelism in Hebrew poetry, where the author is using two synonyms to talk about the same thing. So where God put his sukkah is the place where his tent, that we set these up in the fall for the Feast of Sukkot, but it says that God built one at Shalem, and his place of habitation is upon Zion. If I had nothing else to go on, I would now understand that Shalem is what? Mount Zion. Mount Zion is Mount Moriah, where Abraham offered Isaac. You follow me? These are all names for the same rock, where Rabbinic Judaism says God spoke the world into creation. We're at the same geographic spot, latitude and longitude down to the seconds. Psalm 2:6, the writer of Hebrews started with Psalm 2 as his first reference in chapter 1. As for me, I have set my king upon Zion, my holy mountain. Why do the nations rage against God and his who? Messiah. Where's the Messiah supposed to rule from? It's starting to hammer it home. Now the question is, is any human, this is important, is any human being allowed to claim Mount Zion for himself without consequence? A pagan might do it, and a pagan would receive consequence for that. But we look to King David, and where was his palace? It was over the hill in the city of Jerusalem. David never once claimed Zion for himself. As the king of Jerusalem, Solomon as the king of Jerusalem, and the Davidic line as the kings of Jerusalem. If they tried to claim Zion, guess what happened to them? Bad things. Why? Because of what David says, their father. Make music to Adonai, throne sitter of Zion. The temple's not even built yet. And he says that the mountain up on top of the hill, where you see the Temple Mount today, that belongs to who? God himself. David and the kings, if you went to the Bible Museum, they had one of these pillar caps from the Palace of David in there. It's in the back of the archaeological section. I was the biggest nerd because they had all these sarcophaguses where Jews used to have bones, the ossuaries. You can ask Valerie, I ran right past all of those because there's a temple cap or a pillar cap in the back, and I went, that's actually a Solomonic pillar cap from this palace over the hill in Jerusalem. But David never claims the mountain for himself. He purchases it, and then what does he do? He puts the tabernacle there. He says, I'm sacrificing financially to put God back in his proper place. But from a holy geography, a sacred geography standpoint, what can we deduce from this? Something very important is that Shalem equals Zion, and according to King David, only God sits upon Zion. Only God sits upon Zion. In other words, church, if Melchizedek is king of the mountaintop, he has to be one of two people. Either a pagan who's going to get in big trouble, or it's he who sits on that pinnacle. You follow me? When we start getting to the geography of matters, of what God claims as his, that he keeps saying over and over, I'll return here, things will be resolved here, it solely belongs to God. This is non-negotiable in the Old Testament. That Shalem is Zion. Now we have that. Only God can be there. For this Melchizedek, king of Shalem, priest of the Most High God, met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him. And to him, Abraham apportioned a 10th part of everything. So if we change this for a moment, just to clarify the geography, and we say, for this Melchizedek, king of Zion, priest of the Most High God, we start to narrow who this person is. He is first, by translation of his name, the King of Righteousness. You see what the writer of Hebrews is doing? He's saying we need to move on past the elementary readings of the Bible. You need to dig in. Otherwise, that unnatural story of Genesis 14 isn't going to make sense, oh readers. He is, by translation of his name, King of Righteousness. He's also the King of Shalem. That is the King of Shalom, King of Peace. No father. This is literally how the Greek text reads. No father, no mother or genealogy. Sometimes they spritz it up a little bit and say without. It just says, a pator, no father. A mator, no mother, no mother. Having neither beginning of days nor end of life. Some people say, oh, this is a literary device because Melchizedek just shows up in the text that way. However, now this resembling, if we break that word resembling apart, like I said, it's only used once in the whole of the Bible. It's a combination of two words that when combined says when made in comparison to. That doesn't mean that it's not the same person. He's saying, I'm comparing them. However, when made in comparison to the Son of God, and this is the big kicker right here. Melchizedek, and this is a present tense verb. So in other words, when the writer of Hebrews is writing this, he says this is still actively true of the person of Melchizedek. He remains a priest for all time. That's not in the Genesis text. He's throwing it out there for the reader, saying, this guy, the reason it feels unnatural that he appears in Genesis is that he's the king of Zion. We can establish that from the Psalms. And if you're a good Jew reading this letter, you got to dive through the Old Testament. Oh, where did I see Shalem mentioned? Oh, it's with Zion in Psalm 76. And he's already had you in the Psalms. So he's saying, go back to the Psalms again. And he says that he's also the king of Zion, and Zion will bring peace. Therefore, whoever that is the king of peace. He has no father, no mother, no genealogy. He's a genealogy of one, which is counterintuitive, right? You can't have a genealogy of one, but he's given this idea that he has no genealogy. Having neither beginning of days nor end of life, he's eternal. Where did we see that? Psalm 110. When made in comparison to the Son of God, he remains, or he continually is, a priest for all time. We start to understand that this person, King of Righteousness, is more of a title. And what the writer of Hebrews is doing is exactly what he promised in 6:1-3. Let us move deeper into God's Word. And he's doing it here. He's slowly walking us into some of the harder passages. And he's throwing those nuggets out there that we study by the geography and the names of things, that these are things that only the antitype can control. The real deal. Who is he? Look at what we have so far. We haven't even touched these bottom ones yet. So we have Psalm 110 that Messiah is the priest king seated at God's right hand. In Hebrews 5, he says Jesus is the source of eternal salvation according to the priesthood of Melchizedek. So the Melchizedek priesthood is the only source of eternal salvation. Jesus is high priest forever according to the priesthood of Melchizedek and our forerunner of going into the most holy place. And then he says just today that Melchizedek, who is he? Because after you've read this 3 or 4 times, the question lingering in the mind should be, well, who is Melchizedek? Well, he's a guy without father, without mother, without genealogy. He's throwing it out there. Is he a type? Is he Superman? Or is he the real deal? And the writer's going, well, you tell me. He's without father, without mother. In other words, if he had fathers and mothers and stuff, Moses would have taken the time to convey it to us. Without father, without mother, without genealogy, without beginning or end, and is continually high priest of God. He says that so that in your mind, church, you will go back to the previous mentionings and go, oh, who's the one without father, without mother, who is Yahweh, who controls Zion, who owns Zion? Zion is Shalem. Oy vavoy, I just figured out who this guy is. He's taking you through a very advanced Bible study, and it's one of the most exciting studies you can do. Now, there's one other thing I'm going to throw out there before we break for the day, okay? And this is one of those things that you have to get pretty deep into the text to understand it, but I'm going to try and get it up here on the screen because I want you to see it. The writer of Hebrews just in chapter 6 gave us the Genesis 22 story. And he says, and this is that moral of that story, on the mountain of God, God shall see to it. God will see to this. Then he tells us this story. Melchizedek, the king of Shalem. That word he shall see, or he shall see to, There's Shalem. So Shalem is Yireh. He will see. Yireh, or he shall see too. Okay? When you combine Shalem with Yireh, you wind up with this word that's pronounced Yerushalayim. You know what Yerushalayim is? Jerusalem. He's actually guiding the readers through the stories, because he could have told Genesis 14 before 22, but as you read Genesis 22 first and think about the moral of that story, and we go to Genesis 14 first, these are the two rabbinic stories in the Midrash, the Targums. All the ancient rabbis say these are the two stories where we got the name of the city. It's something along the lines of, he shall see to the peace, is the name of the city of Jerusalem. Sometimes we shorten it and say city of peace. It doesn't mean that. It means he shall see to peace. Well, you already have the phrase on the mountain of Moriah, on the mountain of God, he shall see to it. So they're playing off of that. He shall see to the mountain, Shalem. This is where the word Jerusalem comes from. You see how all this stuff, this writer of Hebrews, he's smart. He's very smart. He's conveying these, and I've said this over and over again, he's conveying these Old Testament stories in a prescribed order so that you will dive into God's Word and come out more mature. More mature. When someone comes up to you and says, with these Middle East conflicts things, well, what does Jerusalem really matter to a Christian? I mean, come on. How many have gotten that? I've gotten it a lot. Is that really important? Is that at the center of what does it have to do with my salvation? Where does God see the matters? Jerusalem. Where, if he saw to the atonement, the final atonement of sin, at that place, where should you logically expect him to come back to? A heavenly expression of it? An immaterial form of it? As many confessing Christians are now saying, this is the new trend. Let's get rid of this because it's too literal. What's the writer of Hebrews trying to hammer to his readers, including us? How important is Jerusalem to the world to come? It's very important. It's so important that he has slowly, if you follow the stories and the charts we've handed out and everything, he's slowly walking us back to Zion being important back where? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And this sacred piece of geography is still important. And it will be important all the way to the very end. Let's pray together. Lord, I pray that light bulbs are kicking on or something, Lord. Lord, guide them in this text. Let them see that this writer is conveying something very deep, as all of your writers do, Lord. Don't let us have lazy ears. Let us not be lazy listeners. There's enough of those going around. Lord, let us seek your text. Let us develop wisdom and understand that your sacred space and sacred time, you're not done with Jerusalem. That it is still important to you, that the regathering of your people is a fulfillment of these prophecies that we read about in your prophets. That we're seeing them, that we can look at those and take comfort in knowing the truth behind them in your scriptures. And as we see a little bit more happen, we take comfort in knowing what your scriptures say. And Lord, there will be hardships, there will be persecutions there will be those who abandon sound doctrine. Down to sacred geography, the place where you actually went to the cross, they will say is irrelevant. Just that you went to the cross. That's a horrible statement. Lord, let us not take your words and split them apart and say this is relevant, but this one, it's just too much. Lord, that will limit our growth. Lord, let us strive earnestly to not be rebuked by you when we appear before you at the end of our lives. Let us be those who you look at us and say, well done, good and faithful servant. And to be a servant is not just to serve the community, but to study your words, because the word servant means worshiper. Well done, good and faithful worshiper. Let us take that seriously. I ask this in your Son's name. Amen. All right. Love you guys. I'm going to leave you with one quote, and then you're welcome to go. I'm going to read this instead of the blessing, but I want you to think on this type. This was Jor-El's speech, okay? They can be a great people, Kal-El, they wish to be. They only lack the light to show the way. For this reason above all, their capacity for good, I have sent them you, my only son. Go in peace.